Welcome to Ripon Community Church. My name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. It's so good to be here with all of you today and worship with you and sing with you and hang out with you. It's great. This is awesome. I love being here with all of you on Sunday morning. As they've been saying, we're in the series right now called The Big Story. And the big story... Hey RCC family, my name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm so glad you found us here online and you can watch one of these messages here online. The goal of these messages is to help you represent Jesus well right where you're at, and we're so glad you can do that here. If you'd like to get connected with a church, whether us as a staff or in different ways, you can go down to the links below. You can do that through the links to get connected. You can also go on social media and find us on social media through those links. And then finally, if you want to continue to support the ministries of RCC, you can find a way to give there. We're so excited that you're a part of this church family and that you want to continue to grow your faith and grow in your ability to represent Jesus well right where you're at. Good morning. Welcome to Ripon Community Church. My name is Sam. I'm so glad that you're here in week 3 of our Resist series, where we are talking about having a countercultural faith in the midst of a divisive season, and we're talking about being defined more by Jesus than our particular political persuasion. How many more P's can we put in that sentence? Lots of different ones. A couple weeks ago, week 1, we kicked it off by talking about our neighbor and how Jesus literally redefines who our neighbor is, and we don't get to decide who our neighbor is. He says we're supposed to love our neighbor and we're supposed to love our enemy too, and that is a different way of living than what we typically see around us. Last week we talked about our goal. We remembered our goal as Christians, as followers of Jesus. We talked about how our goal is to, throughout this season, not squander our reputation by the way that we act right now, so that people still listen when we point to Jesus with our lives after this whole election nonsense, craziness, whatever you want to call it, is over with. So I'm looking forward to that. But as we've talked about that the past couple of weeks, this week we're going to get into something a little bit different. Today we're talking about how to change someone's mind. Now I'm curious, how many of you would like to change someone's mind in your life? Raise your hands. Okay, some of you are telling the truth. Good work. Okay, great. It's a real thing, right? Like for me, I'd sometimes like to change the choice of a restaurant somebody in my life would like to go to. I'd like to go to, like Buffalo Wild Wings. They'd like to go to a place that serves healthy food, right? Like that would be nice to change the mind. Like, let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings. That sounds fun. If you have teenagers, you probably live in a constant state of trying to change someone's mind. Right? Because teenagers are always doing something you do not want them to do. So you are experiencing that on a regular basis. I want to change their minds, please. Oh, and then there's politics, that one too. Today, we talk about the art of persuasion. Something that I've literally taken classes on. Like I've got these books from college. Argumentation. And that's a great book, right? There's that one. Then there's Creating a Democratic Republic. That's a fun one. Also interesting. But then there's Public Opinion. This one will blow your mind. Really interesting. Don't read it. It'll scare you. We're not going to talk about those books and how to change people's minds. We're not going to talk about these ones at all. We're going to look at this one. And that's going to be really fun for us, I think, this morning, because this is the book we're going to be using. We're going to cover a ton of ground today. I told people beforehand I might be a little long. I'm going to try to not be too long, but bear with me if I am a touch long, because we have so much good stuff to cover. Today, more than the art of persuasion, we are looking at how Jesus changes someone's mind. Now, why are we talking about this? Why? What's the reason for this? 2 important reasons. Number 1, to know how to engage in the kind of persuasion that Jesus wants us engaged in. That's the first reason we're talking about this. The second one is this: to know when people are manipulating these tactics for how to change someone's mind with ulterior motives. So we can begin to see it happening in front of us and have that tactic that they use lose a little bit of its power, so we're better citizens, and also we follow Jesus more fully with our lives and can't be fooled one way or the other quite as easily. So, today we are going to be in John chapter 4. We're going to do a whole big chunk of it, and I want to set the scene for you. Jesus and the disciples, they're passing through. This is kind of how a lot of Jesus' stories actually happen. It's not where he was going, it's where he went through on the way there. It's on the journey. This is what happens. And Jesus had gotten really popular in Judea. He and his disciples have been baptizing too many people. People were getting nervous, what's going on here? This Jesus guy is getting too popular. We got to do something about it. So Jesus takes a note and hey, it's time to move on. If I stay here, I won't be able to accomplish my mission like I want to. So he goes from Judea and he's headed toward Galilee. And on his way to Galilee, he goes through Samaria. And a lot of our talks last couple weeks have been about Samaritans, this different group of people, which makes sense because they have a similar view of God, but slightly different. Makes sense when we're talking about politics. That's why we're in this story today. On Jesus' way with the disciples to Galilee, they go through this village in Galilee called Sychar, and it's near a well that the ancestor Jacob had dug. And he sits down at this well, and he's tired, he's exhausted, he's Jesus, but he still gets tired, he still gets exhausted. Sends the disciples into town to go and get some provisions, and he sits down, and while he's sitting down there, a woman comes up. Middle of the day. It's a little strange. As she comes up to the well, Jesus says out loud to the woman, "Please get me a drink of water. Please give me a drink of water." Now this is strange, and we'll get into it. It starts in John chapter 4, verse 9. It says, "The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. She said to Jesus, 'You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?'" So it begins the scene with Jesus, exhausted and in need, asking for help. Now remember, Jesus is fully God and fully human. He's both at once. We forget about the fully human part sometimes. Jesus, he gets thirsty. He gets exhausted, and he has been doing a whole lot of work, just traveled all day in the hot sun, finally is resting. He is parched and exhausted. And just in case we don't realize just how weird it is that Jesus asks for a drink, John makes it really clear as he tells the story. It's not weird because it's Jesus. It's weird because he's a Jewish person asking a Samaritan person who's also a Samaritan woman for a drink. In that culture, that would just not have happened. This would be like a Bears fan at a Packers game at Lambeau going up to a tailgate and say, "Hey, can I have a brat?" No. No, you may not have a brat. Right? This is just what it is. It's not going to happen. So what's happening here? Why highlight Jesus asking for a drink when we're talking about how to change someone's mind? Because when you ask someone for help, something is happening. You're putting yourself in their hands. It is an act of humility. In other words, Jesus is telling this woman, "I'm human just like you. I have needs just like you do. And I'm willing to need your help." Do you know what the first step is to change someone's mind? The very first step is to show them that you're human too, and you're not better than they are. It is an act of humility. I don't know about you, but for me, it's hard to trust someone unless that person shows me their own fears, their own weaknesses or faults. And for sure, it's hard to trust someone that's looking down their nose at you, isn't it? It's the neighbor you borrow a ladder from. You're doing more than borrowing a ladder. It's an act of humility. You'll trust someone who is willing to appropriately let you help them. Like that relationship with a neighbor is suddenly strengthened because you asked for help. They're willing to ask for help. I must be able to have a conversation with them. We're on the same level. We can talk. That's a trust-building activity. So what happens next? she's confused, right? Why ask her, a Samaritan woman, for water? So she asks them. It goes on, chapter 4, verse 10, it says, "Then Jesus replied, 'If you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. But sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket,' she said, 'and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoy?'" Okay, what's Jesus doing here? Here's what he's doing. He's elevating the conversation. Jesus takes a common need, water, something we all got to have, and uses it to point to a much deeper need. A need all of us feel but can't always put to words. Also a need some of us often struggle to satisfy. Jesus is beginning to point to a common value, a deep need and desire, an understanding of what's important in life. Specifically for Jesus in this moment, he's pointing to a relationship with God. The second step in changing someone's mind is to move the conversation to shared values. Not why your values are better than their values. That's not the conversation we're trying to do. We're not trying to pit one set against the other. We're trying to find common values, common ground, shared values. What do you both value together? There's something about common ground that immediately changes the conversation. It can be as simple as sharing a love for coffee. Or sharing a love for smoked meat. I know some people are like all into that whole thing, right? Like that is a thing. And if you both like it, you have something you both enjoy, or a sport you both enjoy. If you want to talk to me about cycling or running or anything like that, or anything outdoors, we're already friends. Like there's an immediate moment where we're talking about those things where we can get together and enjoy each other's company. It's a reality. It can also be as deep as worrying about your kid's future, or wanting to have a job that you really care about and you find meaning in. These can be shared values. For Jesus, it is the most basic need, a relationship with your Creator, living water. Now, this woman is still thinking about the water from the well. It's a little confusing if we're honest, right? But Jesus lets her object. He listens to her questions. He doesn't cut her off. Jesus is not trying to win an argument. And then it continues. In verse 13, it says, Jesus replied, "Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again." He's talking about the water from the well. "But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life." "Please, sir," the woman said, "give me this water, then I will never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water." Sounds pretty great, right? Like, I got to go to the water. Like, we don't at all understand this because we go to the faucet and turn it on, of the 7 faucets in our house, right? Like, it's so easy to get water. Then this was exhausting. Every day, going with a bucket on your head to go and get some water. And so she's still thinking he's talking about the H2O kind of water, but she's starting to realize and recognize that what Jesus is talking about has a greater significance than plain old water. She knows something is broken in her, and she wants to satisfy that deep need she feels. Her mind is beginning to change about this man that she just met. I'm not sure who he is anymore. I thought I knew. He's just a strange Jewish guy. But maybe there's more. So she says, "I want what you're offering," right? Like she just said that. "Even if I don't fully understand it, please give me the water. I'd love to not have to come back here all the time." So Jesus takes it to the next step in our process. He says in verse 16, he goes on, "Go and get your husband," Jesus told her. "I don't have a husband," the woman replied. Jesus said, "You're right, you don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now." He certainly spoke the truth. I'm wondering, when you read this passage, if you've read it before or if you've heard it read before. Does it feel like Jesus is judging her? Like, oh man, look how bad you are. I'll be honest, I've read it that way. I've been confused by it when I've read it that way. But I don't read it that way anymore. I don't believe he's judging her. I'm now convinced that Jesus isn't judging her. He's actually doing the opposite. I think in this moment, Jesus is helping her feel known, understood. He's even commending her for telling the truth. I think there are few things more powerful in this world than being known or being understood. You get me are really powerful words. You get me to feel that way is an incredible emotion to feel known. Think about this. Not only did Jesus engage her in conversation and ask her for a drink of water from her, he did so knowing that she was a Samaritan woman and that she's been married to 5 different husbands and isn't even married to the one she's with now. I mean, in reality, he really should not have been talking with her by cultural norms. And yet he is. The third step in changing someone's mind is to take the time to get to know the person, to really know them. It's to know what makes them tick. It's to know what matters most to them. It's to know why they believe what they believe. It's to know what has beaten them up over the years, in what ways they've been hurt. It's to begin to understand how that all works together to make them believe what they believe. For this woman, I imagine her relationships had left her more than a little skeptical of strange guys walking up to her, more than a little cynical. Been hurt so many times, after you get hurt so many times, you don't really trust anybody, do you? Can you relate to that? But when someone sees you as human, when someone shows that they share values with you, when someone takes the time and is able to demonstrate that they know you, really know you, that is the moment that they're willing to really begin trusting you and changing their mind. Which is why this is where the tables start turning in this conversation. This is where she starts asking the spiritual questions. It's in John 4:19. It says this. It says, "Sir," the woman said, "you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here on Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worship?" Tell me that, Jesus. Do you really know what you're talking about, Jesus? You thought I didn't know anything about this faith thing, but I know something, right? Do you see it, right? She suddenly gets it. This is not about H2O water. This is about spiritual water. And this man, he's earned her trust enough to ask an earnest spiritual question. Notice how Jesus answers. He continues in verse 21. It says, Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes to the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." I don't know if you noticed this or not, but Jesus doesn't take the bait. Like, she's trying to start an argument. You say we worship there, we worship here, who's right? Jesus doesn't take the bait in this moment. He's not having an argument. When you're changing someone's mind, you're not having an argument. He's changing her mind. He doesn't need to convince her which place was the right place to worship God. This is bigger than that. This woman, despite her background, still has the same desires that any human has to know. To know she's known by and loved by, and to be able to worship God, her Creator. And Jesus does not condemn her desire to know, right? Doesn't condemn her previous belief of where she was supposed to worship. He simply points her to something greater, something bigger than a particular religious group's perspective on the right way to worship. He points her to the greater truth. He's not out to convert her. He's out to point her to a good Father who loves her. He wants her to know that Father. And guess what? In the midst of this, she lives in a culture where these kinds of conversations are happening pretty often. People are asking questions. People are wondering what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. She's heard rumblings. She knows that God has not abandoned them. They believe in the same God the Jews believe in, just different way of worshiping and different understandings of him. So she says out loud what she can't help but begin thinking. The thought that's slowly risen inside of her as she's been in the presence of this guy. Man, there's something to him. It makes me think of this thing people have been saying. It says it in verse 25 and 26. It says, the woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. It's at this moment, it's kind of ironic, but this big, massive, reviewing moment gets interrupted by the disciples. They finally had gotten all their stuff. They're bringing it back to Jesus. They walk up, they see Jesus talking to this random Samaritan woman at the well at noon, like, this is a little uncomfortable. Jesus, what are you doing? What do you want to do with this woman? Why are you talking to her? They're deeply perplexed. And the woman leaves in that moment. She knows, like, hey, this is my chance to get away. She leaves her bucket for the water and runs into town. Something in this moment had changed inside of her. She was seeing things in a new way, and she ran because of it. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But do you see what happens during this interaction? Jesus had changed her mind about him, changed her mind about her faith. We'll see why we know that in just a little bit. But he had changed her mind about how God sees her. How? How did he do it? He did it through these very clear steps. Number one, he showed his humanity and humility. Number two, he uncovered a shared value that they both had. Number three, he demonstrated that he really knows her. He understands her. He knows her in this deep way. Number four, he pointed to a good possible future. In the future, we will worship in a different way than in the past. And then number five, he made it clear why she can trust him with her future. He's the Messiah. This is why you can trust me. That's how you do it. Right there. That's the list. That's how you change someone's mind. That's the formula. And if you look at these books, especially this one right here, that's basically the formula that you will find. It's right there. That's it. There you go. Okay. Now here's the hard part about the truth of this formula. Jesus was a master at it. And so are the best politicians and advertising agencies. Jesus didn't copyright it, so he can't get paid every time they use it. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Watch for it. They follow the same exact script. Politician or a person that's trying to convince you of something comes to town, the first thing that they'll do is say, I'm just like you. Typically what will happen is they'll go to a local bar, they'll have a beer, and they'll talk about normal stuff with you. And what kind of drink they get, it matters a lot when people are scrutinizing it, right? Or they'll go to the state fair and they'll have a cream puff and look ridiculous while they're eating it, right? These are the things that you do because you got to act like you're just like everybody else. I'm just like you. And the second thing that happens is I care about what you care about. I care about what you part. So you start talking about the problems they start talking about the problems that they think you've experienced. They'll identify, here's this problem that I think you're experiencing. Am I right about that? You want to have help paying for childcare, or you want to make sure everybody's safe. At least these common things that we care about deeply. They'll identify those. I know you. Right? We have a shared value. And then I understand you and know what you've been through. Like, these last number of years have been so hard because of X, Y, Z. And you're like, yeah, it has been hard. You're right. I'm mad. I wish it was better than this. And then they'll say, here's the future. This is what's going to happen in the future if you just trust me. Can you see it? It's the same exact pattern. And like any good formula, it can be used and abused. So, why are we talking about it today? We're talking about it today because while the formula tends to work, the motivation still matters. Here's the difference. Jesus was not running for office, and he wasn't trying to sell anything. He wasn't even trying to become the kind of king that they thought that he would become. Jesus' only agenda was for this woman to know God, to know she's known by and loved by God, and to be able to worship God. He wanted that for this woman. He had pure motives. Jesus, he wasn't having an argument. This wasn't a competition. This wasn't a debate. This was pointing to something that was true. When we try to change someone's mind so that they can be on our side, we've suddenly placed our agenda over God's purpose. My side. I want you to believe what I believe, think how I think, instead of, I want you to know God. I want you to understand his truths. Here it is. The foundational principle, then, for changing someone's mind in a way that doesn't put our agenda or our side over God's purposes for us, it's this. It's to trust God and be willing to have your mind changed. It's to know that in order to change someone's mind in a healthy and godly way, your mind might be the one that needs changing sometimes. Now, I got to tell you, that probably sounds scary. Out of everything I've said this morning, that probably feels, I'm not sure what I think about that. I got to check in my spirit about that one, you might say, in my gut. Here's why that's scary. Our identities as human beings are often so thoroughly caught up in our idea of who God is, or during this season, which political party is the best one, that the very thought of having our mind changed can seem terrifying. Who are we if we don't vote a certain way or think about God a certain way? The problem with that kind of thinking is that it places our idea of God, our idea of what God wants, above God himself. We replace God with our idea of who God is and what he wants. So we're worshiping an idea, not God himself. Here's what we need to know as Christians, as followers of Jesus. Christians, as much as anyone, must be committed to finding and exploring this one very important thing, truth. We want truth. God is God. We don't need to worry about someone disproving God. They've been trying to do it for ages and nobody's done it yet. It's not going to happen. We just might need to grow the degree to which we understand God. And that is a lifelong process. If you think you have God all figured out, I'm sorry, you're worshiping a false God because you're not there yet. If you were, you'd be God. When we find ourselves discussing something, whether it's politics or faith or sports, there's no need to get defensive or angry because the goal isn't to win an argument. The goal is to more fully understand the truth. And because you're not concerned with winning, because you've already won, as soon as you've trusted Jesus, you've won, you're there. Because you're not concerned with winning, then you can that can change the whole dynamic of the discussion. I don't need to win an argument with you. I know I've won. I got Jesus. Let's talk about it. Let me understand. I mean, even if their goal is to win the argument, if you're curious and ask questions and try to learn why they believe what they believe, the whole conversation will dramatically change. Jesus wasn't defensive. He was confident in the truth. His identity wasn't tied up in winning an argument or a particular political party winning, right? He didn't even argue about where people should worship. Didn't matter. Wasn't the point. Jesus' identity was in his Father, and someone disagreeing with him or not understanding him wasn't going to threaten that one bit. Jesus had complete confidence in God for obvious reasons. So, what happens when we trust God and are willing to have our minds changed because we're more committed to finding the truth than we are getting someone on our side? When that happens, we enter a conversation humbly. We're better able to uncover a shared value. We're more capable of really knowing someone. And this is where I want to go practical today, because this is often where we miss it the most. If you really want to know someone, care for someone, and maybe just change their mind a little, you have to understand them. So let's get super practical. Really, really practical. Here's how to know if you understand someone. It requires that you articulate what you think or why you think they believe what they believe until they agree that you've got it, you understand. Until they see that you really understand them. If you've ever attended couples counseling or went to premarital counseling or something, you probably know what I'm talking about. This is a little tactic called active listening. Anybody heard of that one? Some of you are laughing because, okay, this is an uncomfortable thing to learn how to do because it's hard. But basically what you're doing is saying this comment, what I hear you saying is, and then you repeat it back to them. How many of you have heard that comment before? Yes, you've heard that? Okay. What I hear you saying is X. And then they're like, no, you're crazy. That's not what I was saying at all. And then you go back and you try again. So let's demonstrate that with a completely trivial, non-political thing, okay? Let's just have some fun with it for a second. Imagine you come across someone who seems to only eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That's just all they eat, and you're like really weirded out by it. Like, why on earth would you only eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch? This seems crazy, and so you have an assumption. You start with an assumption. You go in and you say to them, you know what? You like PB&J sandwiches more than sandwiches with meat because you're one of those vegetarian types and you hate cattle farmers and you think anyone who eats meat is evil. Maybe not that far off for some of your thoughts. I don't know. You have an assumption. And you say that assumption to them and they're like, no, I love farmers. I actually don't mind meat. I've got no problem with that stuff. So you ask more questions. You ask me questions, and you correct it. You get a little closer, you say, you know, you like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches so much because you had them when you were growing up and you like how they taste. And I say, yeah, you're closer. But that's not quite it. So you ask some more questions. You understand a little bit more. And then you say, you like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches because that's what your mom made you when you were growing up. And when you have them, you think of her and you feel closer to her, and it's nice because you miss her. Didn't know you could get teary-eyed about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, did you? And how far have we traveled from that initial assumption? Often we assume the worst, we judge. But if you take the time to understand and ask the questions, you'll likely be surprised at the depth and emotion of their reasoning for believing what they believe. I'm pretty sure this is why James says it this way. Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Because Jesus is Jesus. I mean, he could know this woman fully without even asking a question. Because that's Jesus, we have to be more aware of our need to ask the questions and then listen. And even if you're convinced that your opinion is right and theirs is wrong, which is fine, that's not a bad thing. If you are convinced that your opinion is right, go for it. but be committed to the truth, right? If you are convinced that your opinion is right and theirs is wrong, you will at the very least see this person as more human when you ask these questions and understand their reasoning to a whole greater degree and probably gain some respect. In the past week, I've had the privilege of hearing a few people's stories, having a couple of conversations with the class and groups and a few different things. It was coming out more regularly, more often than normal. And what's wild is when you see people's whys, it changes how you see people. Often it's how they grew up, or it's how they've been hurt by somebody, and it's how they've endured through that. If you ask someone to tell you their story, tell their why, be ready. It will probably also change you. And what if this week, instead of assuming, you asked? What if this week, instead of arguing, you listened? What if this week, instead of pushing them to your side, you tried to, together, get closer to the truth, God's truth? The beautiful thing about being defined more by Jesus than by the culture around us or our particular political persuasion is we've got nothing to prove. We've already won. We don't need to convince other people. God uses us and our relationship with these people we care about to change their minds slowly and steadily and sometimes rapidly through the power of God's Holy Spirit. He's the one doing it. We just got to show up. We don't have to be defensive because we've won. And we don't have to convince them of our side because there's one truth, God's truth. The persuasion we're doing is simply pointing to our hope and working our way closer and closer to the truth that comes from God, even when we're talking about politics. Crazy thing happens. This woman, she runs into town, leaves her pot of water at the well, and then goes. And the crazy part about it is it's this woman who has had 5 husbands, went out at noon, which means probably nobody really wanted to go with her. They don't talk to her. They avoid her. She was all alone. And yet she walks into this group of people that live in that town that typically would judge her, and she starts saying to them, guys, I've just met this man who told me everything I've ever done. Could he possibly be the Messiah? And they all come streaming out of town to the well. And the whole town listens, and the whole town hears, and the whole town believes. Because one woman's mind was changed. What if our method of persuasion was like Jesus's, and without feeling this do or die need to get people on our side, we simply pursued the truth the best we could and pointed Jesus the best we're able? My challenge for you this week, get to know someone you disagree with. Get to know them better. Don't try to change their mind. See how getting to know them and having them getting to know you might change both of your minds a little bit. You might respect them more, but in the end, commit to pointing to the truth, to Jesus, and know you've already won. If you want that this week, would you take a moment and pray with me for the courage to have that kind of conversation? Dear God, you are such a good God, to the point where we don't need to fear. We don't need to fear being convinced of something else, because we know that you are what's true, and nobody's ever going to prove you wrong or prove you untrue. You're God, and we can trust that. So help us live like we trust that truth, to not be defensive or feel like we need to convince someone to our side. Help us to have the kinds of conversations that get to know people really, to see what they value, to know them fully or more fully, and by doing so, help point them to the truth that's found in you, the truth that has changed our lives personally. And however that wraps itself up in politics, God, I pray that you'd give us humility, and that in the end, after all this is over in the next few weeks, God, I pray that we would continue to be able to have a reputation that points to you, and people will be drawn to you because of it. Give us the courage to have those kinds of conversations this week. In Jesus' name.